Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think we'll just get started, and I'll introduce my panel as we go along. I sit here. So we have a great selection of speakers. We've just been in the green room discussing this session, which will be on green manufacturing, green business opportunities. And so the panelists, what I'll do, I will introduce them as we go along, as we bring them in. But they cover the range from manufacturers to energy providers to some of the analysts of the circular economy. And we'll try and share with you some of the opportunities, not just green as a constraint, green as regulation that affects manufacturing, but really as an opportunity and as a driver of all of your businesses. So to get us kicked off, Antonia Gerwell is the head of the Circular Economy Initiative at the World Economic Forum. You know the World Economic Forum, of course, that runs not just Davos, but events around the world. And I've been involved in various of their initiatives over time, sustainable energy. But Antonia, tell us, if you can, get us started. Why should anybody care about green in the context of manufacturing, particularly the sorts of countries that are served by the World Bank, IFC? You know, is this really a number one issue to be green as well as to build a manufacturing sector and manufacturing businesses?
Sure, thank you. So I suppose in the context of looking at this issue from a manufacturing perspective, one can look at it from both the risk and the opportunity side. I think I just briefly heard the previous speaker talking about kind of the escalating levels of raw material consumption. So we've basically gone from a point where in 1920 we were extracting sort of 22 billion tons of raw materials per year. 2010 it goes up to about 70 billion tons of raw materials per year. Move that out to 2030, we'll be at 100 billion tons of raw materials per year. And what's happened in the past decade is we're actually becoming less resource efficient. So we're actually consuming more resources per additional unit of GDP than we have in the previous decades. So we're basically, from a pure kind of raw material extraction perspective, moving into a relatively, arguably risky situation. So how do we mitigate those risks, of course, of climate change, water stress, and all of the environmental implications of pollution? A recent study, actually, this past week did some analysis of the impacts of pollution on health. And they basically accounted for the fact that effectively pollution is responsible for more healths than malaria, tuberculosis, and AIDS combined globally. The challenge is that it's very distributed, so it's difficult to tackle. So there's the risk perspective, and I think that's not to be underestimated. But I think more positively is of course, the opportunity side. So if we look at the opportunities of moving towards a more circular economy, you can see that across the entire value chain. So if you start with, for example, your material inputs, look at your kind of the use of the materials, look at your manufacturing production, and then go into the actual end of life, so to speak, of products. There's actually a sort of value in terms of the embedded materials or wasted capacity at every single step of that chain. And the circular economy is really about how do you capture that value. So for example, we know that in terms of kind of end of life, electronic waste, plastics, some of the estimates that we've done and work that we've done show that there's kind of in the order of trillions of dollars of value in embedded value in plastics that is not being captured into the system. There's about a 13% recycling rate. So how do you basically tap into those opportunities, in particular in emerging markets where there currently isn't infrastructure to be able to do that? If you go sort of upstream in terms of kind of using wasted capacity and assets, how do you, within our existing infrastructure, really get much, much more value out of that infrastructure to, again, generate economic value? So you take, for example, new service-based digital business models like Airbnb and others. It is really about finding value in what we are already using to also provide better services to consumers. So I think, from the perspective of how do you think about the circular economy, yes, there's the risk element, but I think more importantly, and this is why business is really interested, is there actually is a true and interesting economic case to be made for why this is a valuable transformation.
Thank you very much, Antonia. Can I ask you, you use the circular economy sort of frame of reference. But when you look at individual investments, individual businesses, it's very rare that they would be involved from through the value chain, or I suppose you want me to say across the whole circle of life of a product. So how do you? I mean, how should an individual business think about it? Why is it a good frame of reference for the audience here that are really looking for individual opportunities, perhaps?
Yeah. So I think there's maybe two answers to the question. One is that it is actually very much, you do need partnership models to make the circular economy work in practice. So for example, I think yesterday we saw a presentation from Indorama, and he was saying, look, as a business, I'm in the waste management kind of business. If somebody brings me the kind of recycled content, just the waste, I will invest in a factory and I will build that facility, but I do need somebody upstream to help kind of fill that gap in the system. So it is a systems approach, and you do need all the different pieces in that system to align to make it happen. So I think from one perspective, it's not just about an individual business, it is about the whole kind of system being put in place. And that's why it's not necessarily happening at the scale that we need it to happen. And that's where we're very much focused on building those partnerships and those value chain collaborations. From an individual business perspective, I think there are a lot of businesses, for example, in that digital transformation space that are tapping into that unutilized asset space. So it depends a little bit on where you are on that value chain of production. Yeah.
Okay, very good. I suspect this is an issue that we'll come back to, the question of whether we can sort of get to circular by the individual actions of players, or whether there needs to be some overarching policy that sort of designs that system. But let's stick with the individual companies for the moment. Fatih Özkadi, you are with Arçelik, a big manufacturer of white goods and other products. And do you want to explain a little bit about what your business does, because the audience may not be familiar with